The morning of March 5, 1953, dawned cold and gray over the Baltic coast of Poland. Inside the Soviet satellite state, the air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin lay dying, his final hours ticking away in a guarded dacha. The entire Eastern Bloc was holding its breath, paralyzed by the uncertainty of what would come next. The Soviet military machine was on its highest state of alert, twitching at shadows, paranoid about Western opportunism during this moment of vulnerability. At the Slupsk Airbase near the Baltic Sea, ground crews moved with practiced efficiency across the frost-covered tarmac. They were preparing the pride of the Warsaw Pact air forces. The aircraft sitting in their hardened shelters were not relics of the Second World War. They were the future. They were MiG-15s. To the Western world, this machine was a phantom, a terrifying silhouette that had appeared over the skies of Korea 3 years earlier and shattered the illusion of American air superiority. The MiG-15 was faster, climbed higher, and hit harder than anything the United States Air Force could initially field. For years, American intelligence had been desperate to get their hands on one intact specimen. They had offered money, asylum, and freedom, launching Operation Mula to bribe a pilot to defect with the aircraft. They needed to see under the skin of the beast that was tearing their B-29 bombers apart over the Yalu River. But the Soviet security apparatus was hermetic. The pilots chosen to fly these machines were vetted, watched, and indoctrinated. Every aspect of their lives was monitored by the Informacja Wojskowa, the Polish military counterintelligence service modeled directly on Soviet SMERSH. The secret was safe, or so the Kremlin believed. On this particular morning, a flight of 4 MiG-15 fighters taxied onto the runway for a routine coastal patrol. Leading the formation was a seasoned instructor. On his wing was a 21-year-old lieutenant named Franciszek Jarecki. Jarecki was the poster child of the new communist Poland. He was young, fiercely intelligent, and a graduate of the prestigious Dublin Military Aviation Academy. He had been scrutinized by the secret police and deemed politically reliable. He was a member of the party. He was trusted with the state's most valuable secret weapon. As the 4 silver arrows thundered down the runway and lifted into the overcast sky, nobody suspected that one of them would never return. The engines roared to life with that distinctive high-pitched whine that defined the MiG-15, the sound of its centrifugal flow turbojet cutting through the morning silence. The 4 aircraft banked toward the Baltic Sea, flying parallel to the coast in a standard defensive patrol pattern. From the control tower, Soviet liaison officers and Polish commanders watched the blips on their radar screens. It was routine. The formation was tight. They were flying a show of force, a reminder that the airspace behind the Iron Curtain was inviolable. And then the impossible happened. At an altitude of 6,000 meters, without a single radio transmission, the second blip on the radar screen simply vanished. Lieutenant Jarecki had disappeared. The initial reaction in the control tower was not suspicion. It was confusion, quickly followed by a cold dread. In the high-stakes world of early jet aviation, a disappearing radar blip usually meant only one thing: catastrophic structural failure. The tower crackled to life. Formation leader, report status of Wingman 2. The response from the flight leader was hesitant, laced with genuine bewilderment. Tower, I have lost visual. He is gone. He just dropped. The Soviet liaison officers exchanged glances. The MiG-15 was a robust machine, but it was not without its flaws. Had the engine seized? Had the young lieutenant suffered hypoxia at altitude? The radar operators frantically adjusted their equipment, sweeping the sector where Jarecki had last been seen. Nothing. Just the empty, static-filled return of the Baltic Sea below. But within seconds, the confusion morphed into panic. This was March 5th. Stalin was dying. The West was watching. If a Soviet-built aircraft had crashed into the sea, it was a tragedy. But if something else was happening, it was a catastrophe. The flight leader's voice came back over the radio, pitched higher now. I see no splash, no fire. He is just gone. On the ground, the gears of the Soviet military machine began to grind with terrifying friction. Phones rang in bunkers. Informacja Wojskowa officers were summoned to the operations room. The possibility of a crash was still the leading theory, but a darker, more terrifying thought began to creep into the minds of the commanders. What if he hadn't crashed? What if he had done the unthinkable? The radar operators widened their scope, searching for a low-level signature, something skimming the waves. The physics of radar in 1953 were well understood. The curvature of the Earth created a blind spot, a radar horizon. If a pilot was skilled enough or reckless enough to fly mere meters above the water, he could disappear from the screens of ground control interception radars. But that was a suicidal maneuver in a jet moving at nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour. Then a remote coastal observation post called in a report. They had seen something, a silver flash, a shock wave that rattled the windows of their watchtower. It wasn't a plane falling from the sky. It was a plane under power, full power. The report hit the command center like a physical blow. The missing MiG-15 was not dead in the water. It was flying, and it was not flying back to base. The trajectory was wrong. The observers had seen the aircraft jettison its external fuel tanks. They had watched them tumble into the sea. This was not a training error. This was a combat configuration. The pilot was lightening his load for maximum speed and maneuverability. He was heading northwest. The realization sparked absolute pandemonium. Northwest did not lead to any Warsaw Pact airfield. Northwest led across the open water of the Baltic, and beyond that water lay the island of Bornholm. Bornholm belonged to Denmark. Denmark was a founding member of NATO. The blood drained from the faces of the Soviet officers. This was the nightmare scenario. It wasn't just a defection. It was the potential delivery of the Soviet Union's most guarded technological crown jewel directly into the lap of American intelligence. The MiG-15 contained avionics, engine metallurgy, and weapon systems that the West had been trying to reverse engineer for 3 years. Scramble everything. The order came down. It wasn't a request. It was a scream of desperation. Within minutes, air raid sirens at Slupsk and neighboring bases were wailing. For more MiG-15 aircraft were taxied onto the runway, their afterburners lighting up the gray morning. But this time they were not launching for a drill. They were launching with live ammunition. Their orders were explicit and horrifyingly simple. Find the renegade and shoot him down. The pilots strapping into their cockpits were Jarecki's friends, men he had eaten and drank with, but the Soviet system did not allow for sentimentality. But the Soviets were already minutes behind. Jarecki had seized the element of surprise. He had used the cloud cover and the confusion to build a lead that would prove insurmountable. What the Soviet commanders didn't know was that Jarecki was flying with the kind of manic precision that comes from the fear of death. He was skimming the whitecaps of the Baltic, flying so low that the spray from the sea was misting his windshield. He was invisible to their radar, a ghost running for the edge of the world. The interceptors roared into the sky, their pilots scanning the gray horizon. But the Baltic was vast, and a low-flying jet is a needle in a haystack. The Soviet commanders gripped their handsets, waiting for the kill confirmation that would save their careers and perhaps their lives. But the radio remained silent. The ghost was loose. Back at the base, the political officers were already sealing Jarecki's quarters. They tore apart his bunk, looking for notes, for signs of Western corruption, for anything to explain the betrayal. They found nothing. No letters, no manifestos, just the empty bed of a man who had woken up that morning and decided to steal the fastest thing on Earth. Approximately 23 minutes after his radar blip disappeared from Polish screens, Franciszek Jarecki's MiG-15 broke through the cloud cover over Bornholm. Danish coastal observers spotted the aircraft immediately. It was flying low and fast, its silver skin gleaming against the gray backdrop. The Danish military scrambled to respond, but before they could even establish radio contact, Jarecki had already committed to his approach. He had never landed on Bornholm before. He had never even seen photographs of the airfield. He was navigating purely on instinct and the brief glimpses of coastline he had memorized from maps. The grass airfield at Ron came into view. It wasn't much, a civilian strip used primarily by small aircraft and the occasional military transport. But to Jarecki it looked like salvation. He deployed his landing gear. The hydraulics whined as the wheels locked into position. He had no idea if Danish anti-aircraft gunners were tracking him, if they would open fire on what they might perceive as a Soviet attack. He was committed now. There was no turning back. The fuel gauges were reading nearly empty. His hands were steady on the controls as he lined up his approach, reducing throttle, feeling the aircraft slow. The MiG-15 touched down on Danish soil with a screech of tires against grass. Jarecki applied the brakes, feeling the aircraft shudder as it decelerated. The nose dipped slightly as the tail came down. And then silence. The engine spooled down. The canopy was still fogged from the temperature change. He sat there for a moment, his heart pounding, scarcely believing he had made it. He had just accomplished what the entire apparatus of American intelligence had failed to do for 3 years. He had delivered a pristine MiG-15 with full fuel documentation and technical manuals still in the cockpit, directly to NATO territory. Danish militia arrived within minutes, rifles raised, unsure of what they were dealing with. Jarecki climbed out of the cockpit, hands visible, and in broken English and German, made his intentions clear. "I am defecting. I am Polish. I want asylum." The Danish authorities were stunned. They had a Soviet fighter aircraft sitting on their grass airfield and a young pilot asking for protection. The implications were staggering. Within hours, the telephone lines between Copenhagen, Washington, and Moscow were burning. The Soviet embassy in Denmark immediately demanded the return of both the pilot and the aircraft. They claimed Jarecki had suffered a navigational error, that he was disoriented, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. The Danes, caught between superpowers, stalled. They needed guidance from NATO command. They needed to know what Washington wanted. What Washington wanted was already in motion. The telephone call that reached the office of General Loris Norstad at Wiesbaden Airbase in West Germany did not bring news of a disaster. It brought the opportunity of the decade. "The package has arrived," the voice on the secure line said. "It is on the ground in Bornholm. It is intact." For years, the United States had been fighting a ghost. In the skies over MiG Alley in Korea, American F-86 Sabre pilots had battled the MiG-15, trading kills in high-speed dogfights. But the Soviet machine remained an enigma. American engineers argued over its theoretical top speed. Intelligence analysts debated the composition of its alloys. They knew what it could do, but they didn't know how it did it. They lacked the source code of Soviet aviation. Now, through the courage of one young pilot, that source code had just been handed to them on a Danish airstrip. Within hours, a C-47 transport plane lifted off from a U.S. base in Germany, banking toward Denmark. On board was a specialized team from the Air Technical Intelligence Center, based out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. These men were not standard soldiers. They were engineer spies, metallurgists, and propulsion experts who carried toolkits alongside their sidearms. Their mission was singular: foreign material exploitation. When they arrived at Ron, the scene was surreal. The sleek silver MiG-15 sat parked on the grass, looking alien against the backdrop of the quiet rural island. The American team moved with surgical precision. They swarmed the aircraft, photographers snapping thousands of images, capturing every rivet, every weld line, every dial in the cockpit. But the prize was the engine, the Klimov VK-1. When they popped the access panels, there it was, the beating heart of the Soviet Air Force. The ATIC team brought out calipers and micrometers. They measured the turbine blades. They scraped samples of the metal to analyze the alloy composition. And what they discovered would shock the Western world. The terrifying Soviet superweapon was built on stolen British technology, crudely manufactured, and riddled with flaws that American pilots could now exploit. The mystery of the MiG-15 was solved not by a spy satellite or a listening post, but by the courage of one man who decided he had had enough. Franciszek Jarecki had just changed the course of the Cold War.